Okay, this is the media panel. We're the favorite panel, so there's a lot of pressure. So hi, everybody. Today, we wanted to focus the panel on how much the public does or does not understand the threat of critical infrastructure hacking and like why they do or do not have the information that they need or sort of the depth of understanding. So the panel has gone through some changes. I'm Lily Newman from Wired. I'm the moderator. This is Andy Greenberg, my colleague from Wired. This is Josh Corman. You all know him, an interlocutor, not a journalist. And our colleague Derek Johnson from CyberScoop, who I believe is a familiar face from last year. And sadly, Maggie Miller from Politico couldn't join us because she's sick, so feel better, Maggie. Okay, so before we really get into this, I was thinking that Andy and Derek and I could talk a little more generally about what we've noticed about how the audiences we write for kind of understand cyber concepts in general and like how that's changed over time. I've definitely noticed at Wired that, the stories I write, the stories Andy and I are working on and our other colleagues on security have kind of evolved, both obviously in terms of what's happening in the news and, how topics evolve over time, but also to serve the audience and give them the information they need. So I'm going to start with Andy just because I know Derek is hearing all of this for the first time. But yeah, Andy, what are some examples of things you've noticed?
Well, this is cheating because Lily and I talk about this all the time working together at Wired. Like, what kinds of stories do people actually care about? What are we going to write like today? And it's really evolved since, we started working together in 2016, but I've been doing this a bit longer than that. And it used to be that you could write about a theoretical attack, something that a researcher did in a lab, or that like hackers did to me in a Jeep driving down the highway. If you maybe remember that, you could do these stunt hacks and demonstrate the possibility of some sort of catastrophic hacking events. And that was enough to really get people's attention. That was the way that the cybersecurity media operated when I started doing this almost 20 years ago. It was kind of all about like what could happen. What if somebody attacked the power grid? And that was enough to really get people's attention, it seemed like at the time. And then people got jaded and lost interest in that, in part because some of those things were happening, not exactly the power grid attack. I'm not talking about critical infrastructure attacks, but there, as other kinds of cyber threats became more real, these sort of like hypotheticals, theoretical things in the lab, vulnerability research was no longer enough for the bloodthirsty audience that we write for. They wanted like to hear about real attacks, real hacking with real victims. And it became this challenge of like finding the actual incidents, which people often don't want to talk about, that have occurred. And I think we both, all of us, have had to look for victims. I did that in part by going to Ukraine around 2016 into 2017. That was not to say that Ukraine is just a victim, but Ukraine is, of course, like this canary in the coal mine, as we all know, where you could find victims of cyber attacks that had not occurred anywhere else. And that became for me like a method of finding stories that I've continued to use up until the present day. But yeah, it's like getting people's attention has become harder than ever, and it has become this, if it bleeds, it leads approach to cybersecurity reporting.
Yeah, Derek, I'm curious about your thoughts. Like, on the one hand, it does raise the bar, and it means we need to like dig deeper and deeper. But on the other hand, there is a bit more sort of baseline fluency, right? Like, there are some things that years ago, like I guess we were talking a bit about an example of like DDoS attacks. At Wired, we still probably would sort of very briefly describe what that is, or a flood of junk traffic, taking down a server, make it inaccessible. But we very briefly in a parenthetical, like we wouldn't have to go into a whole thing about like, okay, the internet, like servers, like, and I'm curious if you have seen or like have examples of that in your reporting, the good and the bad.
Yeah, so I was asked to provide sort of a little bit of flavor about how some of these discussions have developed in the Beltway. And what I would say when it comes to critical infrastructure is we're actually, in my view, in a much better place today when it comes to engaging with bodies like Congress and when it comes to engaging with federal agencies in terms of their level of expertise about not only cybersecurity, but critical infrastructure, OT. I'm certainly not saying that it's perfect, and I'm sure that there are folks who still don't get it, but we are in a much better place today, I think, than we were 10 years ago, both on a staff level and on a member level. And then I would say more generally, like the second that President Joe Biden uttered the words ransomware in 2021, that was, you could notice a dramatic shift in how these issues got treated in the policymaking space in DC. They were treated at a much higher level. They were much more closely merged with things like national and economic security. And I think that that's something that is only going to redound to the benefit of critical infrastructure cybersecurity, even as it has to navigate a very, very sticky congressional path and policy path in this administration.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful because, you know, when we think about the public's perception of critical infrastructure hacking, I think it's helpful also to go back a little bit and think about the way this all kind of ties together on the issue of critical infrastructure hacking, that the media and reporters have kind of been warning abstractly for a long time about these threats, actually, right? It does go back a long way, and sort of like threats of cyber war. And maybe we could start with Andy, but then I know all of you probably have thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, certainly, I think that you know, the example of this is one that I talked about with Josh at the time a lot. But sorry, yeah, to kind of continue this thought of like 20 years ago, we spent so much time talking about what could happen, the threat of cyber war. There were so many of these kind of science fictional future hypothetical stories that I would say in 2015, 2016, when Sandworm in particular, the Russian GRU, you know, the Russian military intelligence hackers started actually bombarding Ukraine with data destroying cyber attacks that culminated in not one, but two blackouts in Ukraine that affected civilians. It was almost hard to break out of that notion that like, oh, actually now cyber war is happening. If you've noticed, like, this is actually affecting real people. Dozens of cyber attacks affecting government agencies and media and an election and finally the power grid. Now this is real. And it was very hard to get people to understand that this was no longer a science fictional story. Now it's affecting real people. And that was in part a huge failure of, I would say, first, to be honest, the Obama administration, to call out that first ever cyber attack that caused the blackout in December of 2015. It was my colleague Kim Zetter who wrote about it for Wired. She did an excellent piece, I think, that broke a lot of new details of the story. I did not see like a lot of widespread attention to that event. And I certainly did not hear Obama talking about the first ever blackout attack caused by hackers in the same way that you're talking about Biden naming ransomware. Obama gave a Rose Garden speech, I believe, or at least some press conference talking about the Sony attack, blaming North Korea. I was at a press conference where Jim Comey, the FBI at the time, spoke publicly about their evidence that this really was North Korea. And then when there's an attack on a power grid where civilians, 250,000 people lose power, there was just absolute crickets, and it was just confounding. And I ultimately, you know, and that lasted for years. That empowered, I think, Russia to keep going and escalating until NotPetya occurred. And then when those same hackers released NotPetya in Ukraine and it spread to the rest of the world and did $10 billion in damage and shut down shipping and pharmaceutical manufacturing in the United States and hospital medical records across the United States. There was still silence for another 8 months until it was attributed, and then 9 before there were sanctions. And I was talking to Josh throughout all of this, like, what the hell is going on? Why are we losing our minds? Is this just like a dream we're having? Why is the government not talking about this? And that, I think, has absolutely contributed to this, to the sense that, like, there was no moment when the government in particular said, okay, now it's all real. All that stuff you've been hearing about, these future threats. Now that's the present day thing that's happening. And it was really hard to shake people by the lapels as a journalist and tell them that when the government wasn't. Yeah, please, Josh.
Josh, what do you think?
So, hi. Just a reminder, I am not a journalist. I don't even play one on TV. Yeah, I'm getting all these flashbacks and triggers from some of those conversations. I think I was kind of losing it too, saying, we've been saying for years that we're not going to cover it until it happens. And now it's happened and we're not covering it. And I wasn't trying to beat you up if that's what it felt like. But I
was just telling you, like, please leave me alone. I'm working on a book. It takes time. Publishers are slow.
Tense conversations.
Yes. I think the thing, whether it was the blackouts or elsewhere, and I think we're going to get to this later, I hope, some of this is a psychological thing as well. We went from like, it hasn't happened yet. We'll care when people die. We care when we've had the first, proof of loss of life. We'll care when this happens. And so we go from ignorant or hopeful inaction to informed but numb inaction. And like the little blip in between where we're informed and acting seemed to pass by really, really fast. I don't even know if the three of you would agree with that, but I was kind of always keeping my powder dry, trying to do the scaffolding and have the frameworks and the rubrics that when the thing happened, we'd have tech literate people talking about it finally, and we'd get a catalyst for movement or an Overton's window. And psychologically, it feels like it takes a lot more to get through to people, and or if it's too scary, a part of their brain shuts off. Tiny example, then I'll get out of the way for you. When we were doing the Cystic COVID task force, we had statistical proof of loss of life from ransom attacks. Like we had the goods, right? Peer-reviewed science. The same day, Wall Street Journal does a front page story on the baby in Alabama. So today, still several years later, people are like, well, no one's died yet from a hospital attack, so we have to do this. So we've kind of collectively failed if we've now got 6 or 7 peer-reviewed medical journals that show the relationship between tech disruption and loss of life, worsen outcomes. But somehow we have not penetrated the imagination of the voters or even Congress folks. Like my best champions on the Hill, when they were ranting about Change Healthcare, denying degrading patient care, burning through cash flow to lead to hospital closures, worsened outcomes and loss of life, there's still a part of them that would say, and patient records were compromised. And like when I have to care about my patient records or my life, I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. So there's just some cognitive psychological barrier that we have not collectively cracked that can give us that actionable middle zone.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is there's a couple of things here. Number one, our policymaking process is notoriously reactionary. When not just in cyber, but for other problems as well, you really need to have a problem punch you in the face before you can get sort of before you can even start kind of having those discussions about moving on a bill that you may have introduced a year ago or 2 years ago, or an initiative at a federal agency. So it's not just restricted to cyber, but some of these things that we were talking about earlier, where cyber wasn't really taken as seriously as other national security topics until recently. And I think some of that has been changing due to things like NotPetya, due to impacts like WannaCry, due to more domestic impacts like Colonial Pipeline. That has really made the argument that I think Andy was trying to make about what this stuff could do to you, your life, the things that you rely on. One Colonial Pipeline beats 1,000 warnings ahead of time. And so I think it's not just restricted to cyber, but every person, official that I've talked to has essentially told me that, we're not going to really get our hands on this from a policymaking perspective until we get punched in the nose. And that's unfortunate. I
guess like repeated punches to the nuts.
I mean, that's the thing, like, You know, I was always shocked when I would like go around like doing my book tour or whatever about sandworm. And yeah, some people, to Josh's point, were like, yeah, but I mean, like, it's not like my credit card is going to get stolen. I'm like, what are you, is that you're still stuck thinking about your freaking credit card? Like we're talking about like actual loss of life. We're talking about, you know, ships the size of the Empire State Building on its side with another Empire State Building's cargo on top of them, and nobody knows what is in them, and they're arriving at ports where like trucks are lined up miles, like unable to drop off or pick up cargo, like entire supply chains disrupted, and then patients in hospitals with incomplete medical records due for surgeries and things. I mean, these are like really this goes beyond your credit card, and I just kept also like even people who took the book seriously or all the reporting, and not to take credit for this, like a lot of people have reported on these things now. They would still say to me, like, it's all so troubling what happened in Ukraine, but could it happen here? That's what I always wonder. And I'm like, no, it did happen here. It happened here. It happened everywhere. Merck is in New Jersey. They literally had to borrow their own HPV vaccine from the Center for Disease Control because their manufacturing was disrupted to that degree. That was in New Jersey. This happened here, and it actually happened again. And there was WannaCry affected the United States, Colonial Pipeline. It's like I do think that it's starting to penetrate people's minds now. To Derek's point, but the inertia has been so painful to overcome.
Josh, do you want to interject?
I mean, we may get this here elsewhere, but just in case we lose flow, I think some of this is they might believe you. I think you've done a fantastic job storytelling. Like when I teach my CMU course, so many slides in there are a headline that you wrote or a book that you wrote, because you're a very good storyteller. All three of you are very good.
You tell me the stories and then I do my best to convey them.
I think it's partly, even if you can engage their agreement that this is bad and this can happen, and it did happen, there's just certain routines that tell us, oh, it won't happen to me, or if it does, I'm insured, or if I'm not insured and it's a really bad catastrophe, we'll just call for mutual assistance like we do with wildfires or hurricanes. So we have even if we achieve that cognition and internalization, we have easy ways to tamp them down in our consciousness. And I think the purpose of this conference was to say, when these attacks show up on water, you're not going to be insured. You can't call for mutual aid. It will be pretty traumatizing. So that I think the last mile here isn't even cognition or internalization. It's getting it to sit and stew to catalyze action.
Sorry, I don't want to take over Lily's job here, but I feel like what you're talking about really, just to name it, is Volt Typhoon, right? Like that is the next sandworm in my mind, and it is targeted at the United States. But the problem is, it is another looming hypothetical in a sense. So it's like, well, it is in the sense that they have not actually triggered disruption in the US, to my knowledge. Maybe you know better. And therefore, people are like, oh, well, now we're back to you just telling me about what could happen and these nightmare scenarios.
Can we go
I
back?
got bored of those 20 years ago. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. Can we go back? Because I was going to say that's where we're going. Is like, why is Volt Typhoon not more of, and it's like threats about 2027, not more of a household name. But like, I just want to map back briefly. Like, first of all, we all know that Chinese hackers, like for years and years and years, have been conducting like massive intellectual property theft. The Obama administration was grappling with this, thought they had sort of had a breakthrough on the agreement, about de-escalating that. The activity did not slow or stop, it turned out. And there have been reports all these years of Chinese hackers at least sort of probing, in critical infrastructure. I was looking at some from like 2009. So that context has kind of all been here for a while, but now, like we have for more than a year now, US officials publicly saying in the congressional record, Chinese hackers are pre-positioning in US critical infrastructure, for a plan that is meant to culminate in 2027. And still, I feel like talking to, whatever, my uncle or something, but also folks like, plugged into tech news, the Wired audience, whatever, we're trying to get that across. And at least at Wired, we've done a lot of coverage from a lot of different angles. And it's strangely like that looming threat doesn't feel like it has totally penetrated to me. So keep going with everything you all were saying.
Well, I mean, I'm mystified, for instance, by the fact that people seem to be more concerned about Salt Typhoon than Volt Typhoon. Just like specifically, it feels like that, like Salt Typhoon. I don't know which of them is a household name, if either is. Very few of these things became a household name, like NotPetya. God, I don't know. Nobody knows what that is, despite I think it's still being the worst cyber attack in history. But it is.
I definitely feel like Salt Typhoon, people were aware of like, telecom hacking, China.
It feels like there was more government attention to it. There were hearings that focused on it more than Volt Typhoon, I think. And there was more attention to solar winds, I think, than there was to NotPetya. There were people saying after solar winds, like, wow, this is so troubling, because in this case, they just did espionage. But imagine if they'd used this supply chain attack, these Russian hackers, to plant a piece of destructive malware. And I was like, they just did. They did that like 3 years ago, and it was literally a supply chain attack that caused $10 billion of damage worldwide. So, I find it mystifying, like that these espionage operations get more attention. And I'm one guess of why that is just because of this navel gazing DC. I'm sorry, not to cast aspersions on this audience, but like politicos who are just concerned about themselves and their secrets getting out. Like people call the DNC hack cyber war. And I was like, that's not at all right. But I can see how it's embarrassing for you and your friends. And so you pay a lot of attention to it, whereas the actual destructive cyber attacks happening in Ukraine at the same time don't. They just affect many more people, civilians, and entire organizations. So I think the same thing may have happened with solar winds. It's like, I'm going to call a hearing about this because I'm concerned that my personal secrets were accessed, and same with Salt Typhoon, right? Like that targeted these high-level people in political campaigns in some cases. And so, but meanwhile, Volt Typhoon is this looming threat to our civilization, arguably. So,
Derek,
sorry,
I'm curious.
I'm absolutely ranting. Excuse me. Go ahead.
I'm curious what you think about what Andy's saying.
So I think one of the things that I would slightly disagree, just in the sense that I think one of the reasons why people pay attention to Salt Typhoon is because they got into the phones of the president of the United States and the vice president, right? That tends to get some headlines, or the incoming president of the United States and the vice president. We don't know how many more. And I would say, Volt Typhoon is, it's hard to convey pre-positioning with the same level of threat. And I want to take it back just briefly to this discussion of storytelling, because I think that that's really, really hard in critical infrastructure as a reporter. I'm going to be honest. I struggle a lot to write critical infrastructure stories where I am both paying due to the technical realities and the technical complications, but able to describe these things in ways that you don't have to necessarily understand the critical infrastructure or have a computer science degree to understand. It's very, very hard sometimes. And I think, like, as an example, you can go too far. And as an example of this, there was sort of a lot of eye rolling, I think, in the CyberScoop newsroom when then National Security Advisor Mike Walls referred to Volt Typhoon's work as setting cyber time bombs. That was sort of we kind of joked around and rolled our eyes, but we were also like, well, maybe that is the way that you get the potential impact of this through. Like, yes, it is a little sensational, and you might get a few cybersecurity folk who roll their eyes at that phrasing, but if that is what conveys to the public that we have these actors inside our critical infrastructure ready to set off destructive malware at a moment's notice. If that's what gets the message through, then maybe that is the way to do it. So one of the things I really like about Andy's work is he's a really great storyteller about how critical infrastructure impacts us and how these attacks impact you in a way where you don't have to go do a bunch of Googling about how IT works in order to understand it. So I would say that that would be my contribution.
Well, I agree with you, Derek, and not just because you're being nice to me, but it's really hard to convey like the why espionage matters to people too. So like that's I agree. Espionage has impacts. It's hard to trace the chain of cause and effect. Like who is going to die as a result of espionage? So people do, absolutely. It's all entirely hidden. It's a very difficult kind of story to tell also in its own way. So I'm not sure why it gets more attention, except that I think powerful people are affected by it primarily. I mean, initially. But I do also think that critical infrastructure hacking affects more people more directly. It's also like hard to get those stories in many cases, but when you do, you can show the cause and effect. Go ahead, Josh.
A couple partial thoughts, stitch them together maybe. One, the naming isn't helping. These names are so stupid. Like there's too many typhoons. No one can tell what they're doing. Salt is embarrassing and scary and dangerous for how pervasive and widespread it was, but it is fair game in espionage. It's in the category of fair game. It's not counternormative. It's just what happens. Like spycraft's going to spy. Volt is a military unit. And we haven't really made that distinction well enough, consistently enough, even on the Hill. Number two, that was partial one. Number two, maybe we picked the wrong metaphor, right? Digital bombs, virtual bombs or remote detonation is a bridge too far because there's no malware. But like picture, and this is a terrible analogy, you want to try, picture like there's a foreign military soldier in your house in the corner every day, comes and goes, hasn't hurt you yet. Do you feel comfortable, hanging out with your family and making dinner and going to sleep? Like they're just routinely coming and going as they want, when they want. We keep finding them. It's on the record. Just because they haven't murdered you yet doesn't mean you should feel safe in your own home. And I think there's a way to do that. Like, look how uncomfortable people are just having tanks in the streets for a parade, right? There's a psychological effect. But because we can't see it or because we haven't talked about it right, it has not yet triggered and captivated that imagination. So it's a bit of a sword of Damocles. Maybe we just need to try 16 different metaphors and decide which one works. But unless and until we capture the imagination, it just sounds like one of those code names I still don't know and get confused all the time.
One thing I wonder about is like Russia's disruptive hacking in Ukraine partly was facilitated by like having this cover of also like kinetic war going on. But then once the full scale invasion happened of Ukraine, we were all kind of bracing for the possibility of like a lot more cyber operations. And in the end, there really weren't, but it seems like that was because kinetic war just sort of took over everything. But like the US is a very different context where I feel like there's just so many disincentives to engage in like physical warfare that perhaps the US should be much more concerned. And, there is this like really pressing reason to try to convey why there might be even more motivation from many adversaries to conduct disruptive cyber operations in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that they're not to like, I don't totally disagree with you. Like,
No, go ahead.
A lot of people in 2022 were like, Andy, where's this big cyber war you promised in Ukraine? And I was like, it already happened, and I told you that. But also, there was more data destroying malware deployed in the first year of the war in Ukraine than we'd ever seen anywhere in the world in the history, of computers in a single year ever. So it's just that it rightfully doesn't take the headlines. In that case, when there are physical bombs dropping on people and the electrical grid, you don't need to don't need Sandworm to like do this Rube Goldberg machine of malware to turn off the power when you can just drop a bomb on a generation facility. Sorry, where was I going with this?
But what about for the US?
Right, but actually the other thing, thank you. The other thing that we learned, I think, in 2022 is that cyber war, if you want to call it that, is in some ways matters most of an effective tool in the midst of a limited war, as we saw from 2014 to 2022 in Ukraine, or perhaps when there is no war, or perhaps like at the time of the outbreak of a kind of proxy war, as we might see with the invasion of Taiwan. So I think it absolutely is like a moment in 2027, again, with the hypotheticals, apologies, but like when that is a moment when cyber war could really matter again, is this ability to disrupt American society or our military response for a short time in that crucial moment.
Let's just saw Bo's face, but one of the best lines Bo ever said with the cavalry is malicious intent is not a prerequisite to harm. And when I look at the Volt Typhoon, do we have a hybrid conflict? When do we have a hybrid conflict? Is it going to be more traditional fighting or something more disruptive? And they can just kill the comms and nobody dies per se, but we can't mobilize or communicate. But you can't just look at the China thing. We also saw tons of water facilities compromised by the cyber vendors out of Iran. You saw the cyber army of Russia reborn, overflow tanks in Texas. And if we're that exposed to accidents and adversaries, it's just a matter of time before you start to see some of this damage, whether it's part of an officially declared war or whether we're just having civilian impact and casualties. And I think part of our job is to be left to boom and prepare and educate and prioritize so that we can put proper, simple mitigations in place. Like we had a whole track 2 yesterday with a lot of kumbaya, basically saying, our normal response to a cyber threat is to cyber up. But for like $2,000, you can put a device in that might make sure that the worst punch China could throw wouldn't damage anything. So I think if we do a good job left of boom articulating these things, there are pretty reasonable, at least stopgap mitigations that could be put in place, or we wait for public policy to be written in blood because we have a crisis of confidence in the public that, wow, a whole bunch of hospitals got shut down because there was no water.
Is the question, what can the U.S. learn from Ukraine in terms of its own cyber defenses?
Beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that, one of the things that I always hear when I talk to people about this issue is that Ukraine has a much more regulated critical infrastructure than we do. And that's a direct result of the attacks that they've been facing from Russia for decades. And so, that's the number one thing we can learn, I think, is that when you have a almost completely private sector owned critical infrastructure with very little government regulation, that creates a mismatch. Maybe there's a way to get there with just private sector cybersecurity defenses. I'm skeptical of that argument. I think that one of the biggest things we learned is that well-regulated, secured critical infrastructure holds up better against cyber attacks than critical infrastructure that isn't. That's my view.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, transparent facilitation. I don't know how much time we have. Should we take some questions? I think that could be good. I don't know do we need to do a mic or what's our, okay. All right, we can start with the man in the blue. Hello.
Hi, Chris Painter. Nice to see you all again. So how much of this is a problem of our own storytelling? Because, as you know, there's constant hyperbole in this space. And you go back to Dick Clark with the cyber 9/11 or cyber Pearl Harbor. I remember talking to him at one point and said, we haven't had the cyber Pearl Harbor yet. And he said, we've had many little cyber Pearl Harbors, which makes no sense. But we keep hyping this up. And so when people don't see these effects, even though they're possible to happen, then people kind of get numb to it and say, I don't care. So part of that is the media, kind of amplifying these, but part of it is also the way the government does it. How can we get around that to get people to really focus on the harm, potential harm?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the flip side of what I was talking about, earlier with storytelling is that you don't want to oversell potential effects. That's one of the things that cyber reporters are kind of schooled at in our first few years on the beat is don't put a bunch of FUD out there and scare people by overestimating the impact. And so it's a really, really tough, in my view, line to navigate where you are correctly conveying the country and world altering impact of something like Volt to a typhoon without devolving into sort of cyber 9/11, cyber time bomb type rhetoric. Like what is the middle ground between those? That's what I'm looking for.
When we were assembling this panel, I was not supposed to be on it, but one of the brainstorming names it was going to have was wolves at the door after years of crying wolf, right? Because we are kind of in that situation. Tom Bossert used to say, like, for crisis management, like hurricanes, like inform, influence, inspire. But on the inform part, it was this notion of you got to tell them what you know, tell them what you don't know. It's a sin to exaggerate it and to downplay it. Like the more consequential thing, the more forthright it has to be uttered. And we've been very, very sloppy in the cybersecurity industry. We've tolerated a lot of hyperbole, BS, marketing spin. Some of those stories got more coverage because the vendors that benefited from them or broke them had really good marketing machines behind the PR. It wasn't just public imagination. It was like, profitable for those entities to be out on the circuit talking about it. So yeah, I want to hear more questions, but like generally speaking, my bigger fear is that we can be forthright and right down the line and not exaggerate and still be cast aside as FUD right now because we dug a hole.
That's definitely true.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm up against that all the time. There's so much skepticism that's we've earned from hyperbole for too long as an industry of, cyber media. But I would say that maybe the solution is stop talking about cyber 9/11s, cyber Armageddon, cyber Pearl Harbor, and just describe what happens, but I'm as guilty. I mean, cyber war itself is an analogy in some ways, right? It's like very difficult not to use these terms to get people's attention, but I guess they come at a cost, So I think that whenever we can, we should just tell the truth of exactly what happened and what the effect of it was. And then the next time when we say and this is exactly what China could do, in 2027, maybe they'll believe us. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to add, maybe the solution here is to focus less on for us reporters, focusing less on the specific kill chain or the way that these cyber attacks move through systems, and focusing on who they impact, who they hurt, the services that they deny, going and talking to the people. That I think is maybe a little bit more effective, whether you're me or whether you're someone from the government trying to get the message out, talking about not ones and zeros, but how this hurts humans and life. I think that has to be more of a factor in our reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said in the Lily's first question, focus on the victims, I feel like is a good approach, and it's an honest approach. Like you found somebody who can actually tell their story of being harmed, and that's a real thing. Sorry, can I?
I think, Josh, do you want to say something, or are you okay?
No, it's just the guy who happens to have the mic is perfect segue from war.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Jonathan Horowitz. I'm with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Really appreciate the panel's emphasis on telling the human story and the consequences. So I understand there's an important tech story, but I think the human story is obviously something that the ICRC is deeply interested and invested in, trying to understand what that relationship is between different cyber actors and what kind of influence they can have in war. But I did want to ask more of a tech question, and it has to do with data centers. And really curious to hear from all of you where data centers have fit within this politics of storytelling, in particular because they're often owned, managed, secured by pretty big, powerful actors, and they have a lot of influence over the municipal actors that we've been talking about here. And so obviously data centers played a big role in the escalation in the Ukraine Russia conflict, and just wondering where that fits within the story.
I mean, the only thing I would say is just that as we continue going down this LLM future that we seem to be going down, where compute is going to be more important than ever, we're going to have more and more data centers. That's going to be a larger attack surface. These data centers are going to hook up into all kinds of services and systems. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but I think that whatever problems we have today are only going to get worse and more relevant 5-10 years from now as we continue building out data center infrastructure.
I'd love to hear what Josh thinks about this, because it's not really like how I've thought about this. I have almost just as a model treated the targets of these attacks as like just their network, wherever it happens to be. And like trying to tell the stories of the IT administrators in the headquarters of some place that is suffering a cyber attack. More and more, of course, like the people in the building, and I think this speaks to like living off the land and the more of the cloud focused token stealing model of modern access hacking. More and more of the people in the building are just connecting to some remote data center, and maybe this focus on the building where the victims are is misguided, and there's a part of the story that should be told about a data center instead. I don't know. Maybe Josh's thoughts about it.
A brief answer I'm not super confident in is I'm biased. I tend to think of what are the lifeline disruptions, and data centers tend not to be when I do care about a data center, it's if that a disruption of the data center has a cascading effect on a lifeline. So too many conversations go to monetary losses or data losses or privacy losses as opposed to life and limb losses. There's reasons for it, right? That's where most of the attacks were. It's not where they have to be, but I try to fight that bias wherever I can. So I'm not indifferent to it, but they tend to be better funded. They're not target rich cyber poor. They're funded. They have a vested interest in keeping those things up. But more importantly, the part I am confident in this answer, cloud native stuff is inherently more distributed and therefore inherently more available, right? Like, and if you lose your water facility, you've lost your water facility. There's not like, oh, I can do a site migration of an Amazon region, in seconds or minutes or even a little inconvenience in hours. So I find some of those things, while expensive, inherently more resilient. But like I said, I'm not loving my answer here.
Got it. Okay, there we go. First of all, I wanted to thank each of you for the work that you've done before. I personally have benefited a lot from the stories and work that you've shared. So I wanted to say that to you. The thing that I think about a lot, I used to run research and intelligence for a dark web monitoring firm. I would almost never use the phrase dark web. It was super unhelpful. It was actually uneconomic. I spent more time describing what the dark web was instead of the actual problem. That stayed with me. And I thought about that a lot because cyber draws from so many disciplines: military, epidemiology, psychology, law, engineering. I can keep going. And therefore you have conflicting mental models and confusing terminology: quarantine, attack surface, vector. These are all different ways to think about it. And I think that's why we're sort of in this place where we're struggling for metaphors. One other thing I wanted to share with you, and then a question. I've been coming up with a Richter scale for cyber incidents, particularly around critical infrastructure, because we're missing that. We knew when CrowdStrike happened, this was going to be fucking bad, but we didn't know how bad.
It's a half of a NotPetya.
Exactly. I ask people this question all the time. It was NotPetya worse or CrowdStrike? And we don't have that. So separate conversation. My question to you is actually related to what the last question was. I've been thinking about AI as critical infrastructure. It's not there now, but it's going to be there soon in terms of so many things are dependent on AI, and AI is dependent on energy, water, et cetera. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that. Thank you again.
Our excellent presenter from Loudon yesterday helped us understand no water, no AI. So
yeah, and I was just going to say, thinking about both of these questions, like I think the same goes for, You can say in healthcare in a lot of fields that like the internet is critical infrastructure, right? Because everything is built on it now. But I guess a lot of times when we're talking about critical infrastructure hacking, we translate it into grid hacks or, electricity outages because those cause internet outages, right? So I don't know. I was just thinking about that in terms of the data center question as well.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to break, at least the government and a lot of folks tend to break down critical infrastructure in industrial sectors rather than by technology. So I do think that as AI gets used more and more, that's going to be more of an issue. I think it's going to be tricky to fit that into the critical infrastructure framework that we have now that is built around industrial sectors. So I don't necessarily see a future where we declare AI critical infrastructure, but I can see a future where our legislative and policy making process treats it that way, if that makes sense.
Well,
Josh, did you want to?
yeah, the way the U.S. taxonomizes critical infrastructure is also wildly unhelpful, right? The 16 sectors are pretty wide. Healthcare and public health includes mortuaries, yoga clinics, hospitals, pharmaceutical. It's a pretty wide swath. So I've always, and I'll repeat it here, I always prefer, and I know you do too, the national critical functions are smaller, more atomic. They're either on or off or degraded. You can manage risks associated with the availability and continuity of operations. So whenever I hear us talking about the 16, I already know where it's too coarsely grained. The 55, isn't a perfect list, as you and I have discussed. We've debated a lot with its author. But even amongst those, I this room knows, but the 12 or so lifeline functions that if you shut them off for 24 to 48 hours, really bad stuff falls apart. So that's where I think we lack the right stratification of critical infrastructure risk. And that's why it's a terrible phrase, but lifeline critical functions is the closest I've gotten to narrowing it from being something super, super vague.
I also just worry a little bit that AI is so big of a topic that I worry it might suck all the oxygen out of a lot of the quite frankly, lower level, but more important cyber hygiene problems that affect so many different critical infrastructure sectors. So I would also just be wary of doing that because that could suck a lot of the oxygen out of the room.
I don't use the phrase. I don't think we use it very often in Wired, like critical infrastructure for readers. It makes sense maybe to classify that for regulation or something in the in the industry and government setting. For readers, like when a threat intelligence company tells me like this group is going after critical infrastructure, I'm like, well, what right. Which one? Because I'm not going to put that in a piece in those terms. But to your point about AI being critical infrastructure, we can say it here, I guess. Like the example I think of is one that Josh told me about, and like totally tipped me off to, which is that when NotPetya struck, very few American hospitals were infected with NotPetya directly. Like a couple, I think only 2 that I was aware of, but dozens of them used this speech-to-text software from Nuance, a company that had an office in Ukraine and therefore was completely wrecked by NotPetya. And this was basically just like today it absolutely would be using AI. Maybe it was at the time. It was a productivity tool. It was like a speech-to-text transcription software for doctors. They would read changes into medical records into this software, and that software failed suddenly, and the doctors didn't know it. So they were making these automated speech-to-text addendums to patients' medical records that nobody knew were being added, were not rather being added. This was like a totally silent failure of this tool in the chain of how they manage medical records. And as a result, tons of patients had incomplete or possibly incomplete medical records. And that was a huge disruption for hospitals across the country. So it's like this, exactly what you're saying, that, now God knows how many of the things we depend on for these just processes are based on AI. And if they failed, who knows what would happen and whose lives would be put at risk.
Are you saying that we're over dependent on undependable things, exposing us to accidents and adversaries?
But yeah, specifically AI. We're going to have to write our own emails, and it's going to be a disaster.
How are we on time? Should we take one more question? Okay. Who's our?
Make it a
yes.
good one.
Hello.
Thank you. Josh, Lily, Andy, Derek, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I'm JD from the Global CC Institute. And one of the things that, I come up against every day across the boardroom is people saying things like, there's no attribution, there's no body count. Right. And so, and we talked a little bit about that, but, in terms of actual like writing, it was easy to say like Chinese hackers, right? But we're talking about hackers in China. There's no actual line in the writing that says this person or this team did that. And that makes a very big challenge for us to be able to say, definitively, here's what happened, here were the impacts. And I think that's missing from a lot of the writing that we're getting. This many computers, this many servers, whatever it is, right? Like those metrics are kind of left out. The other thing that kind of struck me about what we were talking about was the other side of the story is rarely represented. And I hear that a lot from my clients. They're C-suite, right? So like they don't care about anything we're talking about. They just want to know a couple of things. One of the things that they say is missing is the positivity aspect. What did we prevent from happening? How was that quantified?
Yeah.
And so from there, I just wanted to take a moment and ask those questions and say, hey, in what way is the framing of your writing shaping the cybersecurity industry and what we're doing here? And then how can we take, somebody like the expertise of Andy, who's so amazing at storytelling, and leverage that for what we're trying to get, the outcomes that we're trying to get?
Well, thank you. I'm definitely guilty of this. I'll speak to it because I feel like I am guilty as charged, that like I'm not going to tell you about the successes. Like, in fact, who was the co-author for Richard Clark's latest, for the fifth?
Kaneki or the other one?
Kaneki, yes, Robert Kaneki. So Richard Clark wrote the book that we have been, I think, beating up on a little bit, Cyber War. They made all these like Cyber 9/11 comparisons. But then, with Robert Kaneki as a co-author, always got to give him credit. And then they wrote another book, The Fifth Domain. And in that book, they do actually, to their credit, like do the other part of the story that I did not do about NotPetya. Like, let's look at NotPetya and look at the organizations that were not hit, the kind of like opposite of survivor bias, I guess, and try to learn from that. And I find that it's like eating your vegetables. It's like not the most fun story to write or to read. Like, it's hard to sell that book. And, I to be totally honest, like I want to get the biggest audience. That's my job. I want to connect with people. I want them to be like this bloodthirsty audience. I want to give them what they want. And I don't want to tell the positive stories because very few people read them, especially outside of this industry. So I guess that's sort of just like the bias of human nature. But there is, people have done that work in some cases.
But one other thing I want to say about this is one of the other challenges is it like proving a negative or something? It's very hard to, we as reporters, or at least I feel like we've kind of been burned by these stories sometimes, because if it's very hard to show that security protections in cybersecurity, but conceptually in any security, are working, right? Because the proof is that a breach hasn't happened, but that could just be coincidental, or it could just be because adversaries have not decided to cause a breach yet. So sometimes if you do that type of story, you're really taking a risk, because it may not. Anyway, it's not to say we shouldn't celebrate the successes. We should, and I think there are ways to do it. But I just wanted to provide that context that's one reason that it's very difficult to choose which stories to call the successes. Like what we were saying before about the Obama administration's diplomatic work with China that appeared to deter that IP theft for a while, but then it turned out it hadn't at all, and many operations were happening during the time frame in which the Obama administration was kind of touting this success. Like, it's tricky to pick the right stories.
Yeah, no, so I would just say, certainly you're right. I mean, there's room to tell positive stories that can be tricky because of what Andy and Lily discussed. I want to know how many computers, how many servers were affected too. So please tell your clients to be more forthcoming with us so that we can report that stuff, because that tends to be the stuff that they hold most closely. And then, sorry, get me back on track.
Well, I like that point of just like the more transparency. Often Chinese hackers or who is behind the keyboard, that's a tough one for other reasons. But in terms of reporting on attacks and what was happening inside a victim's infrastructure in terms of what went well, we would love to talk about how it could have been worse, but almost never.
I have an example of what Lily was talking about in terms of, reporters are a little cynical around this for very good reason. We get pitched all the time about good stories. And what we learn is to focus not on what they're telling us, but on what they're not telling us. And I have a perfect example. I'm going to name names so that you understand. I met with Microsoft with a bunch of reporters to talk about their, I think it's the Secure Futures Initiative. The pitch was, hey, we are considering cybersecurity in everything that we're doing. It's going to affect all of our products. The huge briefing gave us a lot of quotes. That was the same week that the news about recall came out, which, anyone writing a story about, hey, Microsoft is got this cyber thing figured out. They're prioritizing it at the same week that the recall stuff was happening. You're kind of going to lose a lot of credibility because you're sort of showing that you are falling for the marketing aspect of these discussions sometimes. So you have to be careful. That's not to say that those two things are the same thing or that there's no benefit from the Secure Futures Initiative, but if I were to just take what they told me in that meeting and then write about it, I would have looked pretty foolish that week, in my view. So that's where some of the skepticism comes. But I do hear you that we have to find a way to reward the good stories and reward the good actors instead of just beating on the bad ones. So I'm with you on that.
You can't prove a negative, but I think this is Dan Gear that said this, but apologies if it wasn't. Something like in cybersecurity, our failures are highly visible, our success is invisible. It's just kind of the nature of what we do. That said, there was a fairly positive and well done article when Bo and I were in the Cisco COVID task force. The Verge, I think it was called, like it was Victoria something, wrote a really decent article about how more people likely would have died, but for this team of ragtag people doing something. And it is hard to prove a negative, but there was a good story there. And maybe since Bryson wants us all to take homework from this conference, maybe I can give you a piece of homework to round this out. On the tip of my brain is we can be storytellers. We can tell a tale of victory. We could tell heroic, like how someone was a hero in their own water facility or in their own municipal environment, or what they're doing to help protect the school and the hospital and this. Like we can tell, it's not so much like we beat the bad guys conclusively to 5 nines of precision, but we could probably make people the heroes of their own story. That's the one on the tip of my brain. But your homework is, how can you do within your reach a positive story that's credible so that we can try to equip these folks to do the good storytelling?
Yeah, credible. Like, got to give us the people who are involved. They have to be open. They have to be vulnerable. And that's hard to tell an executive about a company that they're responsible for to be vulnerable with a reporter when they know they're being quoted. And so we want to tell good stories, but we want to tell the right good stories.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to call it, and hopefully we crack this so Josh doesn't yell at us. Yeah, thank you all for being on the panel. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lily.